Now, when it comes to the process of science and the scientific method, there are a couple of different things to understand about it. First of all, science is simply a word in Latin, and it means to know. And so as scientists, we generate knowledge. Science wasn't always dealing with nature and dealing with chemistry and things like, what we now consider science. Science used to be also part of philosophy, and science used to be something that basically gave a formal approach to problems of the day, whatever they are. They could have been scientific projects, such as, what's my goat doing? It could have been social projects. So there are a variety of ways by which science has influenced us for a very long time. In general, it's simply a way to access information in a way so that if different people approach things the same way, then they will end up with the same answer. So if I'm looking at a particular problem in science and I want an answer, and I give you the same set of instructions, then you would come to the same conclusion that I do. That's basically how science works. That means that we end up with that single piece, that single block of knowledge. And so it turns out that science produces very reliable knowledge. And when it all comes down to it, the first people who really ask questions that were in a scientific context were people that were leaders in the ancient civilizations. Once you don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, then you have a little bit of leisure time to ask questions that are perhaps more fundamental, rather than, where is my next meal coming from, or how do I feed my kids, or why is my horse not feeling well. You get beyond that, and in certain societies, especially in ancient Greece, when they had a democratic system and where they had city-states and so on, that protected groups of people, and so individuals could start to think a little bit more about the world around them. So Aristotle was one of the great Greek philosophers, and he was a scientist of sorts because he began to make some observations about the natural world. And nowadays, what we see as the scientific method is a very strict methodology to reveal nature. And so we do this using the scientific method. There are really two parts to this scientific method. The first one is what we call discovery science. And discovery is basically what happens when people encounter nature. I do this. Every summer I take students with me to do field work in biology in Southeast Asia, and we go through the forest and we discover things. Perhaps it's a type of organism never identified before. And we found, with some of the students from here, we found over 25 new species to science. Maybe it's a natural phenomenon that was never observed, and we were able to document it, perhaps photographically or using video for the first time. Or maybe there's an interaction between organisms that was never seen before. So these are aspects of discovery that scientists might want to document. Now, if a scientist, like myself, collects verifiable data, verifiable means that somebody could check on your observation and they could perhaps see something like it again, or they check on it and they can say, yeah, this makes complete sense in the context. Whatever it is, if there are verifiable data, then it counts as a scientific discovery. So scientists don't make up stuff. We document, we describe, and we present. And then it counts as a scientific discovery. So discovery is really the first step in all of this, and it's something that turns an observation, with a couple steps in between, into knowledge. Here's one example of how somebody did this. This is Jane Goodall, and she was one of the first to really do observations on chimpanzees. She did this in a place called Gombe in Tanzania. And she literally sat there and made observations, and she took photographs, and she started to understand how chimpanzee society works. And she documented this by using field notebooks. So she was the one who took photographs and she wrote her observations down. She did these little sketches, and she was one of the first to observe that chimpanzees use tools all the time. She was one of the first to realize that there was a very strict social structure in chimpanzees, not unlike some of the patriarchal societies you see in humans. And so this was all very interesting because nobody realized how organized chimpanzees actually were. So she was somebody who did a lot of valuable discovery science. The second part of this is called hypothesis-driven science. Hypothesis-driven science means that there is now a formal inquiry. You have discovered something, but now you're trying to make sense of it in a formal context. And so what you're going to do in this case is you use this scientific method, a series of steps that make up how we gather knowledge. Now, if you make a discovery and you describe it, it probably leads to some questions. So, I mean, there are lots of things. A bat catches a fish. I mean, how does the bat that's flying around even see where the fish is? Right? That would be a question. You made this observation. That's great. Look how cool. The bat is actually able to catch a fish in the water. But how does he see it? Because it's at night, and bats normally, they see by echolocation, so they're supposed to bounce some kind of sound off the thing that they're looking at. Well, the fish is in the water. It's not looking like a fish because it's the water. So what is happening here? So there's a discovery, and it may beg some more questions. Now, human minds always seek answers. We propose a hypothesis, and sometimes this is simply our best guess for how we can answer that question. So the hypothesis is a potential answer, a first attempt. And based on what you know, this may actually be something that is simply a best guess. Now, I'm going to have to close the door because those people are being noisy. Okay, so done with the slide. Now, the scientific method then is allowing us to take this a step further. A best guess is not the right answer necessarily, so we can't just stop there. A best guess is just sort of, trying to figure out where we're headed with this, but it's not really the final thing. And so, based on our hypothesis, we then use something called deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is where you can make a deduction. It's kind of like Sherlock Holmes, right? Elementary, my dear Watson, I have a deduction for you. So you look at the facts, and based on that, you create an understanding. And sometimes it's very easy to test that understanding. So you understand what's going on, and then based on this understanding, this deduction, you now are going to test the specific idea, and you can figure out whether it's always like that. I mean, it's always nice to know how a specific problem can be solved, but then maybe you want to understand also more generally what's going on, and vice versa. So deductive is a very powerful statement. Now, based on your hypothesis, the hypothesis that allows you to come up with a first approximation of an answer, you tend to be able to create predictions. And prediction have this form of an if-then statement. If this hypothesis is really true, then this is what's going to happen in my experiment. I already mentioned to you this idea of the sun rises in the east. Well, if that is true, then tomorrow morning I can set up my chair and I can look out in the east, and that's where the sun's going to be. So that's my prediction. If my hypothesis is true, then this is going to happen. And so an if-then statement is what's going to allow you to test your hypothesis. Is it really like that? And if it is, well, great. Then, of course, you have your experiment. That's your observation where the sun actually comes up. And you can see whether the prediction actually comes true or not. Now, if you look at this in a flow chart, then the scientific method is really easy to understand. You start out with the observation. And this is literally something from discovery science, something that you witness, something that you see. And based on that, you have some questions. This is human nature. We question things. Now, based on that question, you come up with a potential answer, and that is your hypothesis. And just remember, the hypothesis could be your best guess. That's okay. A best guess is better than no guess. You're trying to come up with an approximation for what works. So that's what your hypothesis is. Based on this hypothesis, you can then create predictions. That's the if-then statement. So just remember, there's going to be an if-then statement in there. And based on that, you're going to run an experiment. Sometimes that experiment simply means you go back out into the forest and you make more observations. Or perhaps you set up some contraption and make an experiment. And then, based on this experiment, you have two options. The first one of these may be that the test does not support the hypothesis. This is what I call the no loop. The no loop is sort of a negative, right? And maybe at first it's a disappointment where you say to yourself, dang it, I thought I had it, but it really didn't work. Now, in science, you don't use that as a disappointment, because in science, even if you don't get what you want, it increases your knowledge, because now you know what doesn't work. Who invented the light bulb? Benjamin Franklin. Close, but no. Edison. That's right. Edison. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And so one morning, did he just, bright and bushy tail, get out of bed and say, okay, I'm going to make a light bulb, and presto, at the end of the day, he had it? No. How many light bulbs did he have to make before he had one that was working?
Like 1,000 or something.
Hundreds, yes. So what that meant for Edison is he went around this loop hundreds of times. And every time he did some kind of light bulb contraption that didn't work, he knew he didn't need to test that one again. You can set that aside and you can say, okay, that one doesn't work. And so with science, the nice thing is that the no loop helps you understand what doesn't work. And every time you go through the no loop, it brings you closer to what does work. And that would be the yes loop. That's over here, the yes loop. And so the yes loop says, okay, the test that I did, my experiment, does support the hypothesis, and therefore I can now make some additional predictions and test those, and I can, I can work with this. I'm pretty good now because I understand what's going on. So normally in science, you may take a couple of cracks at it, and you have to revise your hypothesis because it wasn't quite right. Maybe it wasn't right at all, and you had to discard it and start over. But that's okay. That's a nice thing about science. Whatever you do, as long as you keep tracking and you work towards the goal, you probably will eventually get there. There are a variety of things in science that have taken a long time to figure out. And there are all kinds of secrets out there that we're just figuring out today. I mean, think of some of the recent neat discoveries. I mean, who would have thought that we could actually land a little refrigerator-sized thing on a comet, for Pete's sake, and then figure out what are comets actually made of? Or that we have this other thing that's flying out there, right around Pluto. And we're going to get some pictures of what that actually looks like. And it's going to help us understand whether what we thought Pluto was going to be like actually is what it's like. So sometimes it's a long time in coming, and you know, we will now get to the yes loop based on this information. So it's pretty cool. With the scientific method, you really can't lose as long as you keep going. Now, some of this is very intuitive to all of us because we run into these issues. And here is one example of an issue. Now, I'm going to bring this up real quick because maybe you don't deal with flashlights. My flashlight doesn't work. What's wrong with my flashlight? Those are the ways that you lead yourself into this. You don't think of it as, oh, step 1, my flashlight doesn't work. Step 2, no, you don't think about that, right? But you go through this process anyway because it's intuitive. And then you say, well, what's wrong with my flashlight? You're going to try and come up with a solution because you want this flashlight to work, right? So maybe it's the batteries. And then you replace the batteries, and then you assume that it will work. Now, you don't stand there and say, if I replace the batteries, then you don't make it an if-then statement, but that's essentially how your brain works. You replace the batteries, and ha-ha, it works. There's your yes loop. Now, let's say that it doesn't work. Well, then perhaps it wasn't the batteries. And do you see now how if it wasn't the batteries, that's still good news because now you're one step closer to knowing what the problem really is. Maybe it's the contacts are rusted, or maybe it's the bulb is burned, or you know, whatever it could be. There could be other variations on this, but this is what you work with. Or think about it this way. Here's another observation. My car won't start. That's your observation. So what could be the question? Why, right? I mean, that's how it is. You can say, question, why does my car not start? But you just think, dang it, why? What's wrong with it now? You know, this is how human nature is. And then the hypothesis. Now, what are the possibilities? Why doesn't the car start? Okay, so we have the battery. What else? Starter. No gas. What else? Something locked engine? Okay. Some other unidentified engine trouble. You didn't turn the key. It's not in park. It's, you know, there could be a number of other things. So here are a variety of possibilities that it could be. Now, in my own experience, I would probably start with this one only because, based on my own personal experience, that's where most often the problem was. And so, based on your own personal experience, you refine the hypothesis and you pick one. So now you go, okay, prediction. If I get a boost from somebody, then my car will start. The experiment is you get the boost. And if the car starts, boom, then, okay, you're done, right? Now, if it doesn't start, then you go to the next one. You say, okay, well, I guess it's not the battery. What else could it be? It could be one of these other things. And so, when you take your car to the mechanic and you don't know what's wrong with it, the mechanic is going to go through this process. They're going to do a process of elimination, that's basically what we're doing, to figure out what's wrong with it. Now, nowadays, they plug in the computer, and the computer does it lickety-split. So most of the time, within seconds, they know what's really wrong with it, because your cars tend to record things and so on. But the method is still the same. Whether the computer is involved, or whether you're standing in front of your car with your shoulders shrugging, it is always the same method, and it is the way to find knowledge. And based on these simple examples, I think you'll realize that. Now, I'm not going to go through this particular example. This is an additional illustration from a more scientific perspective dealing with a case study. And this particular case study deals with trans fats. It's a data set. It tells you a little bit of a story, and it follows the scientific method. And you can work through this a little bit yourself. What I want to do is I want to skip through the last set of slides here, the last 2 slides to finish up, because the process of the scientific method does not stop until the knowledge becomes public. Only then does it become useful. I mean, it's great to know that the reason why your car doesn't start is because it doesn't have any gas. Right? It's great to know that. But then, if you don't act on it, what's the point? So, okay, I found out that my car didn't start because it doesn't have any gas. Well, that's nice. I'm going to go back in the house and just sort of sit. That's dumb, right? So you do want action at the end of this. And action is something that most people, when they teach this kind of stuff, don't even tell you about. So here's the action. Now, in the case of this particular study, that the one that deals with trans fats, the researchers found out that if you have a 20% higher concentration of these so-called trans fats in your body, it dramatically increases the risk of heart attack. So let's put this into perspective for a minute. You are the researcher, and you find out unequivocally, based on the data from your lab, from your study, that, wow, how cool is that? If you have too many of these trans fats, then your risk of heart attack increases. Huh, that's nice. What's next? Well, you wouldn't just stop there. You would want to tell people, right? I mean, if I know that something kills people and they don't know it, shouldn't I tell them? Right? So there has to be that connection between what happens in science and what needs to happen in real life. And you wouldn't believe how many examples of this disconnect there are. And there are issues out there today that are like that. Big issues. Some of the big issues, and I'll tell you what some of the big issues are, and I'm not making a statement about them. Find out some of this yourself. Things like stem cell research, good or bad. Things like vaccines, good or bad. Things like, where does homosexuality come from? Things like that. Those are big issues. And they have a scientific foundation. Now, if somebody, or evolution, that's another one. We're going to deal with 2 chapters of evolution. If somebody were actually to take the time to look at the information available on vaccines, on evolution, on global warming, on all of these kind of things, and they would look at the evidence before they say anything, they would do their due diligence, they look at the information, then I think it would change what they say. Or if they say something that's contrary to science, then they would immediately identify themselves as being ignorant or simply unwilling to learn. And there are people like that. Not everybody wants to learn. But here you are. So the assumption is that you do want to learn this stuff. So what you're going to do with this evidence is you're going to turn it into a presentable format called a publication. And that publication closes the loop, if you will. That closes the loop of knowledge. Now, the way we do this is we write manuscripts. And these manuscripts we send to a scientific journal. So here is a manuscript that I'm currently working on. This is a manuscript, and I have several co-authors with this, and we're working on this, and I'm making lots of editorial corrections, and I don't know why I have the little thing. There we go. It's a big manuscript. And so, you know, there's a lot of information in here. It deals with how people describe species and things like that, and so you can tell this involves a lot of work. Now, this will eventually be put into a scientific journal, and in that scientific journal there are going to be experts that will review this information, and depending on the review from these experts, their opinion, they're going to say, yes, the science was good, or no, the science was bad. They're going to tell us what they think, honestly, because they don't want just any kind of writing to appear. They want the things that are true. We're all looking for knowledge. And so the reviewers, they're the ones who are going to check whether this was done right. They then make comments, they make suggestions, or they can even say, no, this is baloney. I don't think this should be published at all. This is wrong. They tell you this. And then the editor, the person in charge of the scientific journal, takes a close look and says, based on these comments, I agree with the reviewers that your manuscript is good to go, or your manuscript needs to add this or explain that, or why did you do it this way and not another way. So there's all kinds of helpful, constructive criticism. So maybe we're not in the no loop, but maybe we forgot to report something, or maybe it is something that needs to be explained better so people really understand. So this is what will happen, and then eventually the manuscript is published, and then its content becomes available to the public. And so I have done this with some of my students. We go through this entire process. We discover something in Southeast Asia. We then figure out what this is all about, what this observation means. We have some questions. We look at a variety of material that we need to understand what we saw, and then we present a publication on it. And so this is the kind of stuff where you can see how science works. Science by doing. And one of the things I'll do is on Piazza, I'll post a recent publication just so you can look at it. You don't have to read the whole thing or anything, but just what it looks like. Because many of you have never seen anything like that. And if it's something that, you know, your old professor produces, then maybe it's interesting. It's probably going to be something on Southeast Asian geckos or something, so that there's some pretty pictures in it. Okay, that's all I have today. That's the end of chapter 1.